all to take a moment to feel your breathing and get into a comfortable position. Start to relax and recognize that your breath connects you with all life. The atmosphere of the planet, the light and warmth of the sun and the light of the stars, the nighttime sky. We are all one. And we breathe into this oneness, and we know this oneness. The first principle of unity is there's only one presence and one power, God the good, omnipotent. You're feeling your oneness in your breath and feeling the life flow through your whole body. I invite you to hold to this awareness and realize the implications of it. There's only one presence. And so there's only one substance, one intelligence, one consciousness, one spirit of love that connects us all. Spirit of love flows all around you, flows in and through your consciousness and in and through your body. The spirit of love harmonizes every part of your body and harmonizes your thought and harmonizes your world. So we let divine love fill our awareness now. One mind, one intelligence, one spirit, everywhere present. There is intelligence in your body, in every part of your body. And from a place of knowing your true nature, you may speak to this intelligence, and it will respond to you. You may speak to your body, tell it you are whole and harmonious, you are strong and filled with vitality. Feel your body responding. You're never separate. Being one with the one infinite consciousness, we have access to all knowing, access to all wisdom. And so in all of our activities, we may become still and receptive to divine guidance. Without knowing how we know, we may know the right way to go. We are one with that infinite mind, that all-knowing spirit. So in this awareness of this divine support in all that we do, we are truly grateful. In a moment of silence, we simply feel that energy, that love, that life, the spirit of gratitude, which is a response of joy to the truth. And so it is. Amen.
Amen.
Well, today I'm going to talk to you about what I think are good reason to believe that the future of that we can be optimistic, I should say, and hopeful about the future of humanity when we take the long view of human history and human existence. When we step back a bit from our current momentary consciousness and obsessions and or our momentary trials and tribulations and struggles, and we step back and we look at how humanity has developed over thousands of years. It's sometimes said that the best predictor of the future is the past. So we're going to be looking a little bit at the past. We're going to be looking at what are called paradigm shifts. A paradigm just means a model, and the idea of a paradigm and a paradigm shift became part of the general popular awareness as a result of a book written by philosopher of science named Thomas Kuhn, who wrote a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in that, he talks about the paradigms, the models of reality that humanity has adopted and how those, what's involved in those shifts. Well, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail about his theory at all. I'm not going to go into his theory, just to mention it. And this idea that we collectively as human beings, our consciousness is evolving. And there have been times when there have been significant shifts of how we look at reality and how we look at life. And so I want to talk a little bit about those, and we can see the kind of development of consciousness that has taken place, a little bit about how those shifts have happened. The basic pattern has been, in different parts of the world, individuals have arisen to, I want to say, not necessarily a higher consciousness, but yeah, usually it is higher, but a kind of different ways of looking at reality. And so these new ways bring new perspectives on our world of perceptions, or what we call the physical world, new perspectives on and understandings of what the word spirit means and what mind is and perceptions. And that, so when we think about the world of perceptions, or what we call the physical world, that's the realm of physics. And when we talk about spirit and mind, we're talking about metaphysics. And finally, there is this pattern or this stream that runs through the history of humanity that we call mysticism. And mysticism is the idea that we can directly experience the divine, the ultimate reality, what we often call God. We can experience that, and that at the very base of our reality and the base of our experience, we are one with that ultimate reality, one with that divine. So that's mysticism. And these paradigm shifts that I'm going to talk about have all been in these different areas and different ways of seeing things. When I say there's reason to be hopeful, I start from the long view. When we think about human existence thousands and thousands of years ago, it was thousands and thousands of years ago, things were much more brutal than they are now. And human beings knew much less about nature and less about the world, less about themselves, less about reality. If you read something like the works of Homer, or some of the older books in the Bible, you're reading about what life was like 3,000 years ago. And what we read in those texts, we discover that, for example, in war, when there were battles, the warriors in those battles aimed to kill all the men in a city or all the men in a region. Sometimes all the women and children also were slaughtered. Sometimes women were raped and enslaved. So things were very brutal 3,000 years ago. But there's again reason to hope. One of the works I want to bring to your attention, if you like to read and you want to read something that's very hopeful and optimistic, that's written in a very sort of scientific way, there's a book called The Better Angels of Our Nature. The Better Angels of Our Nature. And it's written by a man named Steven Pinker, Pinker, who is a scientific researcher and someone who's written a number of different books that have been bestsellers. The Better Angels of Our Natures. In that book, he lays out the evidence for how violence in human life and death by violence in human life has dramatically decreased over the centuries. This might be surprising to us because we are very much conscious of violence and war in our own eras. And we think that, things are worse now and more violent now than they were in the past. But the truth is there was a much higher rate, that is, a percentage of people dying by violence or by war, much, much higher rate in the past. And you can see this as I said, if you read the older books of the Bible, you can see how violent things were. And Pinker points out in his book that once the different states were established, once we became, as we say, civilized, once we became sort of organized, the rate of violent death of human beings decreased from 25% of the population, which a quarter of humanity died that way, to about 8% of the population. And in the modern era, that has decreased to less than 1%. if we watch the news and we read the newspapers, we may think it's more than that, but it's less than 1% in the modern era. And so we can see one of the great general tendencies that has happened in human history as a result of these different paradigm shifts that I'm going to refer to. One of the great general tendencies has been a relative reduction of violence and violent deaths. We could also point to a relative reduction of deaths by things like pandemics and illnesses as well. But also during that time, as a result of those shifts, we have grown and evolved an increasing understanding of nature, including of human nature. And there has been a gradual but definite progressive movement towards greater equality in human societies. From the ancient eras of tyranny and slavery, human societies have increasingly evolved toward equal rights and equal treatment of all people. When I was born, and I won't say how many years ago, when I was born, in the southern states, the government in the southern states sanctioned and enforced segregation. And in the time that I've been alive, that has shifted. So that there are civil rights protections. The situation is still imperfect, but it's much better than when I was born, and there has been great improvement. And this is an example, just during our own lifetimes, how things have changed and shifted towards in a higher direction for humanity. So when you read the newspapers or watch the news, if you do that, be aware that what you're seeing is a small and exaggerated vision of suffering humanity, that the suffering is actually much less and things are more equal than they've ever been before in the history of humanity. So as I said, 3,000 years ago, things were pretty brutal, and there was the first paradigm shift that I'm going to mention happened roughly, and these are all sort of rough figures, roughly around the 6th century BC, between the era of 600 years before the turn of the calendar into what we've called AD or the current era. In that period of about 600 years, there was a shift. Before that era, the human perspective on reality was basically that a religion in which various gods and goddesses manipulated nature, and their understanding of the world was shaped by the various narratives that were written by priests or some of the more educated people in their world. So that was the worldview. But what happened around the 6th century and after, in that period of about 600 years, there was a shift from that reality, that idea of reality as gods and goddesses sort of interfering in nature and in human life, to looking at the world in a rational way, looking at the world in a logical way, and to an idea of another idea that emerged in that period was an idea of what we call ethical monotheism, the idea that there's only one God and that God is good. That happened in that era. So there are various theories, and this isn't just in one place, but all throughout the world. There are theories of reality that emerged in this period. The yin-yang theory in China, the world is consisting of these two basic elements and intermingling in a kind of unity in the divine way, or the Tao in China. That emerged in different parts of the world, in India and Greece especially. A theory of the world as consisting of atoms emerged, individual atoms moving in space, tiny indivisible particles. That idea emerged, but also other models of reality emerged. The idea that there were two substances, mind and matter, is called dualism, or spirit and matter. And even the idea that all is mind. Practically every model of reality that has come forward in the different eras of human history were developed in this period. In the West, mainly among the Greeks and the Greek-speaking people, and in the East, in China and India, is where most of the ideas came from. And so humanity gradually began to shift from thinking about morality only in terms of divine commands that were revealed through priests and prophets, to thinking about things like laws and morals in rational ways, thinking about consequences or thinking about what might be at the fundamental basis of our ideas of good, ideas of love, and so on. So there's a shift in moral consciousness as well as a shift in the way people looked at reality. Also in this era, that period, right, starting right around the 600 years BCE, the 6th century, there was an emergence of mystical ideas. The belief in the possibility of conscious union with God, of rising up into a higher consciousness of reality, a reality built on what we might today call divine ideas. In the West, you see this especially in the works of Pythagoras and Plato. In the East, you see it especially in the writings that were in India and Hinduism that are called the Upanishads, and also in the teachings of Buddhism. See, all of these religions, the religions that Reverend Maya was talking about when she was lighting the candles, most of them emerged in this period. So Taoism, Confucianism, there were great changes in Hinduism in terms of, especially that when you read the sort of philosophical mysticism you find in the Upanishads, there are shifts in the consciousness of reality. A variety of different perspectives emerged, and people started thinking seriously about the nature of the world, the nature of God, and the nature of humanity. The idea of ethical monotheism, the one good God, was especially influenced in the context of Jewish thought in the Middle East. Right around right around 600 BCE, the work of Isaiah was written. And in that work was the first definite statement in Judaism of there being only one God. Now, this might surprise you, but before that was explicitly stated in Isaiah, in Judaism, there was a belief that there was one God that they were to worship, that God was the supreme God, but they did not deny that there were other gods. Okay? You can see hints of this, but you can actually see this as you read the scriptures carefully, that they believed that there were other gods, but their God was supreme, and their God had chosen that people, the people of Israel. What happened, the shift that happened in the prophetic writings of the prophetic era was this idea that there was one God, and this God was the God of all people. So Israel's role, in their view, shifted from being God's chosen people. They were still chosen, but not to be sort of exalted above the nations, but to show the nations the truth of this one good God. And also in the same era, you see among the Greeks, the philosophy of Stoicism, which also was, fundamentally an ethical monotheism, slightly different than in Judaism, but still the idea of one good God and living according to virtue, living a virtuous life for the Stoics was sort of the highest goal of humanity. So humanity began to shift in consciousness from ideas of an anthropomorphic deities manipulating nature and interfering in their lives towards an idea of an imageless God, a God who was spiritual, a God who was beyond our concepts of humanness. And they also in the same era began to become aware that there were detectable laws and patterns in nature. They didn't quite figure out, what all those laws were, but they recognized what they called the logos, the reason, the pattern, the order, the word of the divine that organized all the changes in nature. They became aware of this in this era. Well, what happened next? And one of the things to realize about these shifts that I'm talking about is they generally start with individuals who have kind of an exalted or a higher way of thinking, but those ideas don't immediately enter into the collective consciousness. It evolves over time. Gradually, more and more people start getting these ideas in different ways. At first, it's mainly among those who are the most educated, but gradually the ideas drift down to others who become more and more aware of these new ideas, new ways of seeing things. So the second shift happened right around the 1st century. So in this era, the tendency was, a kind of merging of what we can call this ethical monotheism and rational mysticism, the idea of a mysticism that involved an understanding of nature and a mysticism that involved thinking in clear ways about the nature and new ways about the nature of God and humanity. Now, of course, one of the key figures in this era, that first century shift, was Jesus. Now, Jesus was, entered into a world in the context of a kind of messianic Judaism, and that was what we see that idea to a great extent expressed in the New Testament. Yet, a closer attention to his sayings and an awareness of historical criticism of the New Testament, and looking at what Jesus said and comparing it to sort of what in other cultures people were saying, what we see is in Jesus' teaching is a mysticism. This idea that the kingdom of God is within you is a sort of classic and clear statement of what the mystic believes and strives to realize. And when you read the writings of Christian mystics through the ages, you see that the greatest mystics are always going back to this passage. The kingdom of God is within you. And using this as a key to interpret what Jesus said, that it's all about an inner kingdom. It's all about finding God within. We also see in Jesus' lifestyle and how he taught his disciples to go forward and preach the good news, what we see is something very similar to a philosophy among the Greeks. It was called the Cynic philosophy. Most of us think of cynicism a certain way in the modern era, but the Cynics were not kind of what we think of. They've sometimes been characterized as the hippies of the first century, because what their belief is that people were too attached to the things of the world, that if we conformed our lives to nature, the nature's way of things, and if we the Cynics thought about God as our Father, and that in living close to nature and living free of human artificiality, living authentically, we become more God-like. And so these views that are found among the Cynics are very much reflected in the New Testament. Many modern New Testament history scholars are very much aware of this close affinity between the very earliest Christians, Jesus and his original apostles, the similarities of what they proclaimed and how they proclaimed it to what the Cynics proclaimed and how they proclaimed it. The Cynics were kind of an offshoot of or influenced by Socrates, who had a big influence on Western thought, obviously, in that first era that I talked about. So, what you also see in this first century in Judaism was a Jewish philosopher named Philo, who lived in Alexandria. He's often called Philo Judaeus, or Philo of Alexandria. He was a contemporary of Jesus, but he lived in another part of the world. Philo interpreted Hebrew scriptures allegorically, what we in Unity called, he did metaphysical interpretation. He saw in the scriptures, the stories, and the statements symbolism for Pythagorean and Platonic ideas. Pythagoras believed that the universe was fundamentally mathematical, and that was a very far advanced and very influential concept of the world as we now see it today, that the world is ordered in ways that we can discern and that we can most accurately describe in terms of number, in terms of mathematics. And so that entered into Philo's writings, as well as the ideas of virtue and good that were taught in Plato's writings and that originated with Socrates. By the way, Philo is interesting because he indicates that he provides evidence that the Western world was somewhat aware of Hindu philosophy, not deeply or broadly aware, but aware of it and some of its ideas. Philo also writes about the Essenes, who you've probably heard of, and the Therapeutae, which were in communities in Egypt who were not renowned as healers and who were probably actually Pythagoreans. So Philo's view was somewhat influential in his own time, became less influential as Judaism evolved, but now it seems to be emerging into awareness among Jewish scholars and Jewish thinkers who are developing a higher respect for Philo. Well, he came from this same era, combining mysticism and sort of philosophical idealism, a rational mysticism, with ethical monotheism. Later on, a man named Origen lived also in Alexandria. He was a Christian philosopher and theologian. He's sort of the first systematic, brilliant Christian scholar. He translated the scriptures from Greek and Hebrew, and he also provided allegorical interpretation. Origen's interesting because his teachings will have tremendous influence on Christian theology, even though some around 400 years after his death, the church, in a different state of mind, declared his teachings an anathema. The truth is they were already deeply influenced by the way he thought about things in their writings. Well, he, in addition to that allegorical interpretation, taught universal salvation, that in the end all would be saved, all would enter into the divine realm. And his philosophy was about becoming more and more Christ-like, and that was the sort of the goal, become more divine. And in order to do that, in order to reach the heights, Origen taught there is reincarnation. It takes sometimes more than one life to arrive at that point. So Origen's view is very much like our modern Charles Fillmore's view. In that same era, and that what I call the second paradigm, you can call it that, one of the most important Hindu philosophers came along. His name was Patanjali. He lived in that same era, and he wrote something called the Yoga Sutras. The Yoga Sutras were the foundation for yoga practices of all types. The things that we think of as yoga today were built on these simple Yoga Sutras of Patanjali. He taught it was a rational mysticism. It had a kind of metaphysical basis, but it was fundamentally about practices, the meditative practices by which one could attain certain spiritual powers. And attaining these spiritual powers was not the end point of his view. The ultimate end point was to merge with the infinite one, to let go of all these powers and simply merge into the divine consciousness. So that yogic system developed in this same era, what we could call the second paradigm. So then that goes on, as I said, for a while, and then right around the 8th century, the 7th, 8th century, into the 15th century, and we're really getting it more into the modern era. What happens is now the metaphysics and mysticism begin to more and more merge together as a worldview. So the oneness of God and the oneness of all things, and realizing that, and that is the basis of reality. But also in this era, a new interest in what we call natural science emerged. Basically what happened was that in the Western world, philosophy and thought and religion really were influenced primarily by either Plato or Aristotle or both. Plato was an idealist. He believed the ultimate reality were I'm going to just say, were divine ideas, the idea of good and truth and justice and so on and so forth, that was the foundation of all reality, and that the natural world was just kind of an imitation of that, a sort of shifting shadow built upon these divine ideas. That was Plato's view. Aristotle, however, who was a student of Plato, took on a different perspective. His perspective was, well, no, nature is the reality, and human beings just come up, abstract these general ideas that Plato was talking about. So Aristotle was much more interested in the natural world and studying the natural world. And so in the era of that we're talking about now, up until the 15th century, what's generally called the Middle Ages, you see a shift of more and more interest in studying the natural world because of this influence. One of the interesting things about that, by the way, is that Western thinkers had more or less set Aristotle aside. They still read him, but they were mainly influenced by Plato. In the Islamic world, which again, it developed in this period, in the Islamic world, the philosophers and the thinkers were more interested in Aristotle. And weirdly, during the Crusades, these two worlds came together. And the West was deeply influenced by what they were reading among the Muslim philosophers who were studying Aristotle. So Aristotle first went east to the Middle East and then shifted back to the West and became the most influential philosopher in that era. So again, this is sort of the foundation of what we would call the scientific worldview. It's not really science yet, but it's the start of it, where they're studying the natural world and trying to understand it, how things work. And this becomes a greater and greater interest in the educated circles. And this begins to shift humanity's consciousness again to try to, I want to say, link the metaphysical and mystical ideas with what later is going to be known as science, or what was then known as the philosophy of nature. In this period, between the 7th century and the 15th century, Christian mysticism especially, and also Sufi mysticism in the West, flourishes. And of course, it's flourishing also in India. So one of the forms of mysticism that's developed in this period by a very influential mystic who is known as Dionysius, he developed something called apophatic mysticism. It's a fancy word for saying we can't really fully describe the nature of God, that somehow God's nature as infinite is incomprehensible, that the best way to understand God is by saying God is not this, God is not that. There's a form of that mysticism also in Hinduism, right? So instead of trying to define what God is, we try to move beyond our concepts to an experience of that which cannot be conceptually described. As Dionysius put it, we use whatever appropriate symbols we can for the things of God. With these analogies, we are raised upward toward the truth of mind's vision, a truth which is simple and one. The supreme cause of every conceptual thing is not itself conceptual. It cannot be spoken of, and it cannot be grasped by understanding. So God is to be experienced, and that experience is beyond anything that we can conceptualize. And this is a sort of touchstone of a true mystic. They may give descriptions of their experiences and their ideas, but ultimately they all say, well, there's nothing that we can say that's completely true about God, because God transcends our concepts. God transcends our understanding. It's a lot like the number, what we call the number infinity. We can understand the idea of infinity. It's just like we think about it in terms of numbers or in terms of points or objects, that they're limitless. There's no sort of end to it. That we can get that as a concept, but we can't comprehend what infinite number is, because it is inherently incomprehensible, right? It doesn't have an ending. It doesn't have a border that we can look to and say and define, this is what infinity is. And what the mystics were saying is that's true of God as well. We can experience God, but we cannot really truly describe God. We cannot define, put borders around the nature of God. Another interesting development in the same era, by the way, in India, was started by a great Indian philosopher named Shankara. Shankara introduced, or sort of developed, I should say, non-dualism, the idea that there's really only one reality. God alone is real. Okay? So it's very much like the unity first principle. God alone is real. Other ways that his students expressed this was consciousness is supreme being, or even I am the supreme being. Others said, thou art that, or Atman is Brahman, the self is God. And so that idea enters into Hinduism and is developed in Hinduism in this same era. By the way, Meister Eckhart, who you probably have heard of, he's referred to in Eric Butterworth's works and others, was a great mystic of towards the end of this era. And Eckhart said that the core of the soul is the central silence, the pure peace and abode of the heavenly birth, the place for this event, the utterance of God's word. Beginning was the word. Here God enters the soul with all he has, and not in part. God begets his Son in the core of the soul and is made one with it. Man's whole blessedness lies in that unity. Thus, in God, all things are equal and are God himself. This is a sort of talk that got Eckhart in trouble with the official church in that century, but he does develop these ideas of mysticism to a very high level, a level that is so high that even today we find people who are interested in mysticism studying Meister Eckhart. Well, the next shift takes place around the 15th century and comes into like the 19th century. And this is the era in which physics and metaphysics and mysticism become the primary ways that people view the world, or at least the leading thinkers view the world. And I won't go into a lot of detail in this because I'm realizing, okay, this is a lot to take in. But I would say this is the period in which Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, they develop the physics, the laws of nature, and begin to understand the real picture of the solar system. This is a period in which Sir Francis Bacon develops the basic principles and ways of organizing and specializing science and the scientific methods. This is really the beginning of the scientific era. And strangely, it's also an era in which idealism in metaphysics becomes more developed, to the point one great philosopher produced a tremendously influential case for the idea that mind is the ultimate reality, that all we really know are our perceptions of ideas. And this has a tremendous influence on how philosophy develops. And then what happens around the 19th century, starting in the 19th century, is this idealism and physics and metaphysics and mysticism all get merged into a new way of thinking. In the 19th century, remember, towards the middle of the 19th century is the end of slavery in America, and later on, women then gained greater equality, including the right to vote in America. There's a push towards a more diverse and egalitarian society. That, of course, is not complete, but it's been going on since that 19th century with the Transcendentalists of Emerson. And then New Thought comes along, the Vedanta Society, Baha'i, Theosophy, all of these particular movements, Transcendentalism, New Thought, Vedanta, Baha'i, Theosophy, these are idealist metaphysics that seek to be compatible with science and have fundamentally a mystical and spiritual perspective rather than one we might call religious, rather than a spirituality structured by an ecclesiastical organization and rituals and dogmas. There's an opening to the divine at the level that have been practiced in the mysticism of the Middle Ages and earlier. But now a broader and broader part of society becomes aware of these ideas and enters into these new religious or spiritual perspectives. Now, that just started in the 19th century, so the way these paradigm shifts seem to work is every 400, 500, 600 years, people catch on to those who are sort of in advance of their age. And so it's not complete, but it appears to be the direction that things are going. And we see this even in the writings of the most advanced physicists of our era, of the 19th and 20th century. Now, I can point to a lot of different ones: Einstein, Sir Arthur Eddington, who designed the experiment that verified relativity, who understood the theory of relativity and a great deal about quantum mechanics. Eddington wrote this in one of his essays on the inferences that we can draw from science. He said it this way: to put the conclusion crudely, the stuff of the world is mind stuff. And he goes on to say that this mind stuff is of course, something greater than our general individual minds, but it's maybe more like our subconscious or unconscious, and yet the conscious mind is connected to the subconscious and then to this ultimate universal consciousness. Another great physicist, astrophysicist of the era, Sir James Jeans, wrote that we are led to the conclusions of Berkeley. Remember, Berkeley's the one who demonstrated the idea that all that is real is mind and its ideas, or spirit and its ideas. So Jeans says we are led to the conclusions of Berkeley that the objects exist in my mind, but ultimately, Jeans wrote, their objectivity arises from their subsisting in the mind of some eternal spirit. This is strange talk for a physicist, but Jeans and others were driven to this conclusion that reality may very well be there's just one mind and we all participate in it. The founder of quantum mechanics, one of the founders of quantum mechanics, quantum physics, Erwin Schrödinger, wrote that there's only one mind, only one consciousness. He said the overall number of minds is just one. I venture to call it indestructible, since it has a peculiar timetable, namely mind is always now. There is really no before or after for mind. The world extended in space and time is but our representation. Experience does not give us the slightest clue of it being anything besides that, as Berkeley was well aware. And so now in this new era, as we are developing, more and more people are becoming aware of the great, not only of new physics, but also of the mysticism of the past and the practices and how mystical practices, especially meditation, can lead us to a higher consciousness, perhaps to that realization of the divine that the mystics have always spoken of. And so today I'd like to close by simply describing that basic practice in mysticism that's called meditation, the basic stages of it. These stages are taught in the great works of Patanjali, who wrote the Yoga Sutras that I mentioned earlier, but also in the Buddhist traditions in various ways, and even in Unity's five-step prayer approach. These are real basic practices that can lead us to great benefit in terms of our health, in terms of our consciousness. So what I'm going to do is invite you to, as I am describing this practice, to enter into that space yourself, to sort of follow the directions, the stages as I describe them, and experience them in these few moments. Ordinarily, for meditation, in order for it to be truly beneficial, we want to spend at least 15 minutes. We're not going to do that today, but this will give you a sense of the basic pattern that is described as long ago as Patanjali and as recently as in the context of Unity. So what we're going to do is turn our attention inward in search of the divine. The first step is really simply relaxation. So I'm going to invite you to sort of follow this idea. One of the things that what Patanjali taught for one step or stage is posture, what he called posture, and the other is breathing. So I invite you to find a comfortable posture, your head up, but sitting comfortably, your back straight, or if it's easier for you to sit in the lotus position, or if it's easier to lie on the floor, you can do that now in your own room, in your own space. Just enter into a comfortable posture or position, and then begin to simply observe your breathing. Feel it as you inhale and exhale without trying to control it. Feel it all the way down so that you can even feel your stomach expanding and contracting with your breath. Just observe it. Let it take on its natural flow and feel it. As we sit in a comfortable posture, observe and feel our breathing. Allow it to become deeper and regular. We begin to physically relax and the mind becomes calm. Just breathing. Second step flows out of this observation of breathing. Buddhism, it's called mindfulness. Now sit comfortably. Allow yourself to observe not only your breathing, but just what's happening in your thoughts, or what's happening in your feelings, what's happening in your body. Simply observe it without attachment, without judgment, without trying to control it. Become the observer without concern. Allow it to flow before you like a movie or a song. Just observe what's happening without attachment, mindfulness. The next stages are simply called concentration. You can now direct your attention to some idea of good. Patanjali taught, you can concentrate on anything that appeals to you as good. So you might choose some name or idea of God. The very ancient idea of God as Father or God as Mother. God is infinite spirit or divine love. You can focus on a statement, an affirmation, I am one with God, or there's only one presence and power. Some simple statement or description of the divine, and just let your attention flow to that thought. If you want to, you can use a prayer, such as the Lord's Prayer. Choose a point of focus, whatever appeals to you right now in this moment, and just keep your mind focused on that. Allow the idea to unfold its meaning and its feeling and its truth in your consciousness. Concentrate on repeating the idea or simply holding it in your mind. It begins to unfold its secrets to you, which are rooted in the divine oneness. No matter what you have chosen as a focal point, as it unfolds, you go deeper and deeper. More and more transcending words and concepts to a space of knowing and realizing that you are one, realizing the oneness, realizing the truth, the deeper truths, realities underlying this point of concentration. So this is where we go in meditation, within, to ever deeper levels of consciousness over time, great, until we may perhaps lose all sense of space and time and ego, simply rest in the perfect peace and love, life and light and bliss of the divine. We may want to stay in this place for long periods of time. But we know that right now, that we'll have to keep for later. We close this time together. We must bring our attention back to the world of perceptions, to the world around us. But know that your state of mind has changed a little. Notice that. You begin to see things in a new way. You may feel more contentment. In these brief times of meditation, we may even experience physical healing. You may experience joy and gratitude. And from this new and higher way of being, as we enter into the mystic depths, we can go forth and add harmony to our world. And so it is.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We're coming all back to being together slowly and with the daily word and what we just listened with joy and bliss and these words and the daily word about smiles. Can we bring back a smile to each other as we open our eyes? I always say, can you put the light and the peace that you just experienced into your eyes so that when you open them, you greet each other with shining eyes and smiles. Yes. So we come to the end of our service. We want to be mindful, reminding you of the activities of the coming week, as well as the need for your continued financial support of Unity Center through the various forms that are made available. Don't forget us in your donations, in your giving, in your monthly giving, in whenever you have a moment. Monday at 2 is a joint meeting with the search committee and the board to update and to plan procedures, etc., taking steps. Then on Wednesday with Wilma, the study group on Eric Butterworth's Unity, A Quest for Truth. And then on Thursday, we usually have the chaplaincy team at 1 o'clock. Wilma's class is at 5 on Wednesday, and the chaplaincy is at 1 on Thursday. So this is the week. This is us as a community. We are going to close by saying our prayer for protection. And I'm going to leave the Zoom room open. Afterwards, we can chat with each other. We can ask questions. We can make any comments we want. So stay on. You can now unmute yourself, please. Everybody do that. I don't have to do that from here. And we're going to say together the prayer for protection. The light of God surrounds us. The love of God enfolds us. The power of God protects us. And the presence of God watches over us. Wherever we are, God is, and all is well. And so for a moment, hold the hands of the people right there on the screen. Feel that you're holding hands. You know, there are loved ones right there. Our nice growing circle, holding hands in spirit. And you're becoming multi-sensory beings who are able to reach across time and space, right? All right. God bless you. I'm going to stop recording now.
Thank you. Thank you.
And we're on. We still have our Zoom room open, and I'm happy to see you all here. If anybody has any questions, you have to unmute yourself. All right. Do we have some people on phone lines? Terry? And we have any other people on phone lines with us?
Teresa.
Yeah. Hello, Teresa. Our love and blessings.
Yes.
And we have Teresa and Lester on
Yeah.
the line.
Also, love and blessings, Lester and Teresa. Love and blessings from Unity. And Nikki, do you have somebody on? No. What about Gloria? Oh, we did Terry.
I have Terry.
Okay.
Terry's here.
And then Merlin, do you have
Jennifer.
Jennifer? Love and blessings, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Aha, it's so great. Thank you, Merlin, for making the link, the contact. So you better grab hold of James. He's still on with us. If you want to ask any questions before he goes, anybody have, you all have to unmute yourself. We cannot hear you otherwise.
I don't have any questions, but I have, because it's too much that I heard, but I just have deepest gratitude to you for sowing so many seeds of thinking and reflection. It was absolutely wonderful.
Thank you,
I
Marjorie.
realize it was a lot. Mainly, I just wanted to get across the idea that there's hope, that humanity is moving forward, even if it doesn't look like that way in the daily papers. If we take the long view, things shift, and we're in the middle of a shift now. So,
Wonderful.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
my pleasure. Thanks for having me. Okay. Well, I'm going to step away for a few minutes. If you are all going to chat for a while or whatever you want to do, and if you're still here when I come back, then I'll continue with you. But I'm going to step away for a few minutes.
Well, we see you again. If we don't see you now, we see you next month on the third Sunday. We already talked about and confirmed that, and I'm so grateful.
Look forward to it.
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Thank you. Namaste.
Hello, Pauline.